Okay, here we are on the eve of the revolution. That's just an expression. Um, I am going to talk about revolution a little bit today because the term that is used to describe what happens at the end of the 17th century in British culture is called the Glorious Revolution. I don't think it is really a revolution by definition, but neither is the Industrial Revolution, which we will be talking about after the midterm exam. So if you've been following the lectures, and I hope you have, because we have a midterm on Friday, we left off sort of with the English Civil War splitting the country in half and people taking sides, whether they were brothers or family, uncle, nephew, father, son, sometimes didn't matter. It was a religious and political divide that sort of put the conservative political religious people on one side. In other words, the Catholics, the Church of England, and the King, and the people who supported him on one side, as the Cavaliers and the Cavaliers and the Royalists. Their nickname was Cavaliers because they had long hair and usually had better equipment, better weapons, looked more like knights, whereas the Protestant, Puritan, more Protestant, religious-leaning people, Puritan, or in some cases Presbyterian, which is the Church of Scotland, or Chanlo Gyohe in Korean, the parliamentarians, who were nicknamed the Roundheads, because they often didn't have fancy long hair, probably because they didn't have soap and a bath very often, to be honest. So they cut their hair. In Korean it's mori, which is head and hair, but they're round heads because their hair is kind of cut in a straight line. You would probably call it, in American English, you'd probably call it a bowl cut. It's just basically you stick a bowl on your head and then cut it around your head, so your head looks kind of roundish. Think about Korean middle school student boy haircuts. That's pretty much what their haircut looked like. And they had less money. Their equipment was not as shiny or as fancy, and they were more of a populist faction, and they were not necessarily trying to kill the king, but against the king's policies. In the end, they did kill the king because the radicals, especially Oliver Cromwell, who we discussed in the first video lecture this week, he became the Lord Protector, and before he was the Lord Protector, he was the cavalry commander for the Parliamentarian Army under Lord Fairfax, and ultimately he pushed for the king to be executed because the king just wouldn't give up. Charles was a very stubborn person. I've heard professors call him stupid. I don't know if stupid is the right word necessarily. Certainly stubborn, and right up until his death would not change his mind and would not compromise any of his beliefs. And his primary belief was that the king had absolute power and should not be questioned, and so he went, to his execution believing that he was protecting the divine right of kings, which had been handed down to him through, a dozen generations of English kings and queens, for that matter. So, 1688 is after Charles II, his son, is invited to come back, and his Charles is Charles's son, Charles II, has a brother named James, and James II, when Charles dies, James II takes over, and he happens to be a devout Catholic, which the Protestants of England, who fought during the Civil War, were not very happy about. Still, people remembered Bloody Mary, and still people remembered the Spanish Armada, which happens to be exactly 100 years before 1688. And they remembered the gunpowder plot, which I mentioned to you briefly in class, but I told you you don't have to remember the 5th of November. But it is November 5th, 1688, the anniversary of the gunpowder plot, and the centennial of the defeat of the Spanish Armada, that William and Mary, James's own children, his daughter and his son-in-law, so his own daughter and her husband, come from the Netherlands and invade England by invitation. So I think I've mentioned 1066 is the magic number that all British history students have to know, or they're not worth, they're not worth their own salt, or whatever expression you want to use. That's a basic fact that all history people of studying British history have to know. 1066 is when William the Conqueror invaded, and that's the last time that anybody successfully invaded England. That's not really true. It's just that other times people invaded and they never managed to stay. They were, for one reason or another, they were not able to sink in their roots and conquer the way William the Conqueror, which is his nickname now, did. So, but William does actually peacefully take over pretty much after he lands and he starts marching across England with his army. James doesn't really want to fight, I guess, and maybe his soldiers and his army recognize that. Charisma and morale are very important in war, and they just sort of switch sides to William, and his army gets bigger, or they just kind of melt away, just go back to their homes. So as he comes across England, he ends up not really having any real battles, just marching across England to the capital, and James leaves and goes to France, and that's what we call in French a fait accompli. It's an expression we use in English too. I'm not even sure if I'm spelling this right. Should have checked this before I started my video, but it's already finished is what it means. Fait accompli. So it's once William gets to London, they just have to put the crown on his head, but there's really no choice. James is gone. There's no other army. The Dutch and English and German Protestant army is in London, and they have control of the city. So is it glorious? I don't know if you can really call it a revolution, but in a sense you could probably say it's glorious, because the glorious part about it is that I guess the religious people at the time would have said the glorious part about it is that the Protestant wind has come again and supported the Protestants, and the Catholics have been defeated, just like the gunpowder plot and just like the Spanish Armada. The wind has come. James actually had ships that were supposed to stop William from landing, and the wind changed direction and blew down the channel, and his fleet was unable to go out and prevent William from landing, and the Spanish Armada was blown into the North Sea, and the storm came, and somebody got a hold of a note and prevented James I and his parliament from being blown up by Guy Fawkes. These are all kind of, it's kind of destiny or good fortune brought by this phenomenon called the Protestant wind. And the fact that it's on the anniversary and the centennial of these religious events just made it, I guess it made the name make sense. For anybody who's religious, they believe that God was with them and that Protestant Englishmen were the chosen people. If you believe in that, situation, that's fine. That's probably what they believed at the time. But I think there is another aspect of it, which is also glorious, and it's the fact that nobody died. And, the dynasty changed. William became the king, James left, and really there was a political change and a sort of revolution, a step, at least, another step in the, the progression from the Magna Carta, like I said, to the modern system of constitutional monarchy, where the new king had to accept more limitations and more power sharing, policies and rules with Parliament, without a civil war, without 5% of the population being wiped out, without the bloodiest battles in English history happening. Instead, you just have a new king, without the War of the Roses, without the 100 Years' War, or William the Conqueror, killing as many people as he can in northern England. None of that happens. William III becomes king, and then they fight against Louis XIV, which is a foreign war. And this sort of solves the problem of religion and foreign policy and sovereignty at the same time. The financial situation still is a little bit rocky, but there's a commercial revolution happening at the same time, where the Bank of England is created, and the government, the crown, has more options for funding its military and its expenses than it ever has before. So that starts to get solved, and the problem of local and central control will be solved pretty soon, because in 1707, Scotland is going to become part of a country called Great Britain, the United Kingdom, and British culture will officially begin, which means that there's going to be a balance between London at the center and all of the regions, including Scotland and Wales. Not so much Ireland. There isn't as much balance there, but that will basically, the 5 things that have been a problem for the last 200 years, ever since Henry VIII became king, more or less get resolved. Not completely, but they're under control again, much more so even than when Queen Elizabeth was the queen. Let me talk about the 2 important people that I've chosen. Just like the 14th century in chapter 2, I just decided on these 2 people. There are many other people that are important, just as Wycliffe and Chaucer are not the only people that we should talk about. Neither are John Locke or Isaac Newton the only people that we can talk about who are influential in the 16th or 17th century. Shakespeare certainly is one of my 16th century choices, but in the 17th century, I just chose these guys. Isaac Newton, you probably already know. He I don't know if you want to call it discovered or invented or defined gravity with a formula. He wrote the Principia Mathematica in Latin, which made it available for everyone, not just English people. He was a genius. There's no doubt about that. He did some experiments with prisms and light, and he invented calculus. There's another guy, I believe his name is Leibniz, who invented it almost simultaneously. Maybe he was German. I'm not an expert on the history of calculus. I just know that Isaac Newton did partially contribute to the invention of calculus. So he became the chair of physics at Cambridge University, and that position was occupied most recently by the, well, not most recently, but by the recently deceased Stephen Hawking, who you may know or have heard of, famous astrophysicist who wrote books about black holes and about gravity and event horizons and other very interesting things, non-Newtonian physics, as it were. But Isaac Newton redefined the world for everyone, for Europeans first, and then for the rest of the world too. In the same way that the ancient Greeks tried to explain the world using formulas, it's the same sort of thing as Pythagorean theorem: a squared plus b squared equals c squared, or Einstein's famous formula E equals mc squared. Isaac Newton has his own formula for G, for gravity, which once people realized that's how the world works, at least on Earth and on planetary bodies, and that gravity was a force that you had to calculate in order to do things, it changed things forever. So he's a pivotal figure culturally for British people, but for everyone. John Locke was a political philosopher. He's most famous for this expression, tabula rasa. He was involved in this debate during his time about basically whether human beings were, evil or good or bad from birth. And his theory was that everyone is a blank slate, and that we are formed by our environment, not that we are inherently good or inherently evil, but that social systems, society, and our environment is the most influential thing. And I'm a big fan of John Locke. I don't think he completely was able to capture the human experience, but part of the human experience is obviously what we know and what we learn and who we are influenced by in our life. And that was what John Locke essentially believed in. If he didn't believe that you were born in a certain way and that you were destined, predetermined to be something, which was a dangerous idea at the time, because religious people believed, whether they were Protestant or Catholic, that God had complete control over everything, and that your environment was a really non-essential part of who you were. The important part was what God chose for you, not your choices or your parents' choices or society's the systems that existed. But he's a sort of political philosopher. You might say he was like an early sociologist who believed in political systems being able to improve society. So he wrote about that. He wrote about individuals, he wrote about people as groups, and he wrote about politics and social systems. And people have argued for and against his theories ever since. In the same way that Isaac Newton, affected mathematics and physics, John Locke affected politics, social studies, and philosophy. That's my take on him, and you can read in the textbook. You can read, which I've been holding upside down. You can read in the textbook at the end of the chapter. There's a section on both of them to fill in the gaps, which I didn't talk about. At the very end of chapter 3 is a section that's way too short, but it's about Scotland. What I have to say about Scotland boils down to the main cultural elements that people are familiar with, because I can't go into any more detail. Scotland is in the northern part of the United Kingdom. It has less people. It has a distinctive character, which is related to its religion, which the Highlanders were Catholic, the Lowlanders were largely Presbyterian, but they're all Christian and pretty. They had some very strong opinions about religion, but the biggest effect of their religious or their religiosity, their religiousness, was the fact that they encouraged people to read the Bible, especially in the southern part of Scotland. So Glasgow and Edinburgh, there was an entire group of educated Scottish people. Adam Smith is one of them. He's mentioned in the textbook later. Maybe some people call him the father of capitalism or free market economics. He was the one who advocated the invisible hand and less government interference in economic systems. But there's David Hume, and there's a whole group of them. I off the top of my head, I'm going to forget the majority of them, but the group of them is called it's called the Scottish Enlightenment as a whole, and it's partly because the literacy rate in Scotland is very high. So this education is a product of, first of all, reading the Bible is the first thing that they do. Everybody learns to read the Bible in English. People are still speaking Gaelic, which is Scottish language, but they're reading and writing in English, and they become a very highly literate society, and they start reading other things, and they start studying and being creative, and it branches into, like David Hume, history, or Adam Smith, economics, or eventually, this is the wrong generation, but Alexander Graham Bell invents the telephone and stuff. A whole group of people who end up pursuing different branches of knowledge, like engineering, innovation, science, economics, philosophy, politics, literature. There's a whole group of them, and it's not just 17th or 18th century. It's a high proportion of the population, and this is a product of their religion influencing their effort to learn how to read, and then going beyond the Bible itself and studying other things. They're famous for being tough. This is probably partly because it's very cold, partly because the country is very rugged. It's not close to if you're gonna survive in Scotland, I think whether it's now or hundreds of years ago, you had to be tough. Whether that meant, survival skills, hunting, farming, chasing sheep on mountains, or, fighting with swords or guns, I'm not sure, but there's people like this in other places in the world. It's just geography is destiny. I told you at the beginning of the class. Scottish people are tough. They make good soldiers, and they're tough people. They might come across a little bit gruff and a little bit less gentle, I suppose, is the nicest way to say it. But this is also the reason why that country and that culture still exists, because they want to survive and they want to be themselves. I think Koreans have a little bit of this too. Kenyans always win the marathon in the Olympics and in the big international events. The Nepalese, were famous fighters in South Asia. There's groups of these types of people all over the world. The Appalachian, American settlers were famously tough fighters, that kind of stuff. And they're also independent. They're fiercely independent. Some of the people in the Appalachian Mountains in America are from Scotland. So there's a connection there. So in the end, I want to wish you all good luck. The Glorious Revolution wasn't really a revolution, but in some respects, it was glorious. Please finish reading chapter 3, and just remember the introduction. All you have to know is about the cultural studies section near the end of the introduction is all you have to know. You don't have to know the entire introduction. Chapters 1 to 3 are what you need to focus on, and like I said, focus on the things I emphasized, and get some rest before the exam. Do your best, and be satisfied with your effort, and that's all you can do. So, see you on Friday. Thank you for listening. 11 o'clock, the exam begins. See you then.